Thousand Eyes gives us our three different agent types. We have the cloud agent, now the endpoint agent we want to look at, and also the enterprise agent, which we are still going to look into. But as we drill into the endpoint agent, it starts to give us a very unique vantage point in all of this. I mean, really, all three of our agent types have a unique vantage point, and we're going to combine all of these vantage points together to give us a complete view of the network. But as we look at the endpoint agent, we are specifically going to find a couple of things, especially with how Cisco describes the perspective that the endpoint agent gives. For example, first of all, they refer to this as a high amount of detail, but providing a low amount of context. So high detail, low context. What exactly does Cisco mean by this? Well, the perspective here is that we have an endpoint, and we're going to have the agent deployed onto the endpoint. And again, its perspective is coming as close to the user as it can get. And so we're going to see a lot of details. For example, we're going to see the web traffic itself. As it traverses the network, it goes maybe to the web server, and then we get responses from the web server. We're going to see a lot of those details. We're also going to see details such as my Wi-Fi connection, potentially my local area connection. Maybe I have a wired connection on this device. But we're going to see a lot of details around the actual network connectivity, again, from a user perspective. But as we zoom out, or maybe attempt to zoom out, we're going to find that we can't really do so, at least not very easily. Compare this to the cloud agent. When we're looking at the cloud agent out here, the cloud agent is deployed into a particular service provider. And usually it's looking at other service providers. And it's really good at trying to figure out, hey, what's the scope of the outage, if there's an outage, or maybe there's slowness on the network or something along those lines. So when we try to zoom out, what we're trying to say is we're trying to establish the scale of the particular issue. Maybe this is a problem with many service providers. Maybe this isn't a problem with the service provider at all. Maybe the problem is actually with the network. Well, we don't get that from the endpoint agent, unfortunately. We do get a lot of these details, but if there is a problem, let's say with the web traffic, or there's even just a problem with pinging the server, we have no idea of knowing, is this the LAN? Is it my Wi-Fi? And yeah, maybe we have a bad Wi-Fi signal, but ultimately, is the service provider at fault, or for that matter, is the application itself down? Because if the application itself is having a problem, I'm not going to know whether that's the case because of the application in the cloud, or if it's a problem with something in between. So this is what we mean by saying we have a high amount of details. We get a lot of these details, but we have a low amount of context. I can't zoom out and identify where exactly the issue is thanks to a single endpoint agent. Now from here, Cisco also refers to the endpoint agents as existing in the last mile. The data we're collecting is supposed to tell us what's happening here, and so we probably want to ask the question, well, what does Cisco mean by last mile? Well, Cisco is defining things from the perspective of the cloud, which probably makes sense since Thousand Eyes is a cloud service. So imagine we have some kind of application that we're running in the cloud space. This cloud is a cloud provider. It lives inside of a data center. And then we're going to connect to this application vendor via the internet. That internet is going to come into some kind of corporate network. And then that might traverse a wide area network to get to our site, at which point we're going to have a local area network again, or possibly a wireless local area network, and then we'll have our endpoint here at the end. So the reason why Cisco's calling it the last mile is because they're describing this section at the end of this journey. Now, if our perspective is, hey, I'm on an endpoint, and so this is the first mile for me, and I'm trying to connect up to this cloud, I mean, that's well and good. It just depends on your perspective, I suppose. And again, Cisco is choosing to view this from the perspective of the cloud and our internet resources. So the last mile is truly the last leg of the journey here, And we need to know, for example, is there a Wi-Fi issue? Maybe I've got really bad wireless coverage. Or for that matter, maybe there's something else happening on the network or even on the endpoint itself. Maybe we're just completely out of memory and we're having problems from that perspective. So again, high detail, low context, as well as last mile evaluation and data collection, these are the properties of the endpoint agent. Now, just like with all of the other agents in the Thousand Eyes environment, the endpoint agent is intended to be proactive. And this is especially worth noting because there are a lot of tools that we might deploy onto our endpoints to do some troubleshooting. For example, I might get on here and deploy Wireshark to try to figure out what the problem is when there's a problem. But this is reactive. These are tools that I would deploy and then start to troubleshoot maybe what's going on there. Well, the endpoint agent is intended to be proactive. This means that these should be deployed to all of our endpoints in our entire network when we're establishing our Thousand Eyes environment. This is different than these other tools because we are expecting that if we're going to run Thousand Eyes, that we will be deploying our endpoint agent to all endpoints. This is something that every organization is going to have a conversation around because we don't necessarily love deploying agents everywhere. And for that matter, we're going to need some kind of tools or just a process in place to deploy all of these endpoints to lots and lots, or all these agents to lots and lots of endpoints. So we're going to need to think through the process for deploying all of these agents everywhere. And we're also going to need to be comfortable with deploying our agents and having these agents running on all of our endpoints. So that's an education concept that we need to make sure everybody's comfortable with, that this isn't something we'll deploy if we're having a problem. We are going to be running the endpoint agent continuously moving forward once we have established our Thousand Eyes environment. Now, another consideration is how do we perform our connection? And we did demonstrate this briefly earlier. We'll take a detailed look coming up. But as far as connecting our endpoints to our cloud environment for Thousand Eyes, we are going to use the concept of a connection string. So this connection string is going to be something that is extremely long. I'm going to have to copy and paste this in some fashion over to my endpoints. And so when an endpoint comes online and it's trying to connect up to the Thousand Eyes environment, keep in mind, Thousand Eyes is a multi-tenant infrastructure. We have probably tens of thousands of customers attaching into the Thousand Eyes cloud. And so which of these Thousand Eyes customers does this endpoint belong to? Well, the connection string here is going to be shared with the Thousand Eyes environment. And so Thousand Eyes is going to know that, hey, this is part of my organization. And so we're going to need to make sure that we have a good way of getting this connection string onto the different devices. Trust me, it's way too long to type out. We are going to need to copy and paste this around. We also might find that we need to perform a reinstallation of an endpoint. This could be for a number of reasons. Maybe we deprecated a laptop, but then somebody's laptop broke, so we need to take this laptop and reinstall it into the environment. And at that point, we're going to use what's known as a reinstallation key to bring that device back online, because we don't want to make Thousand Eyes think that this is a new client. This is an existing client, one that's been attached to Thousand Eyes in the past. And so we use the reinstallation key when that occurs. So it's not going to be a very common situation, but it is something that we should be aware of. At that point, when we install the endpoint agent, we'll need both the connection string and the reinstallation key. But most of our deployments will only be using a connection string. Now, one concern in all of this continues to be, how do I do this process that we're talking about? How do I deploy this to so many different endpoints, especially for large, maybe even global organizations with endpoints around the world? Well, fortunately, we do have bulk install options. And this is primarily going to leverage Windows group policy. So we are able to deploy the endpoint agent out to many different endpoints at once. And this will hopefully allow us to scale up our operations beyond just a few endpoints. Now, for the purposes of this course, we're going to be focusing in on a lab environment, and so we'll be taking a look more at the individual installs. But as we perform these individual endpoint agent installs, we're going to learn that, yeah, taking advantage of something like the group policy to do our bulk installs is going to be much appreciated compared to logging into every single endpoint and performing the installation ourselves. So this is an overview of the endpoint agent. From here, we can drill into the details of how the endpoint agent is architected, as well as how we go about deploying it onto our endpoints.